A disrespectful CEO fires a janitor, unaware he's a retired Special Forces operative. The gleaming glass towers of Apex Industries rose high above the bustling city streets. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tension and ambition. Employees hurried through the corridors, their eyes glued to screens and their minds racing with deadlines and targets. At the heart of this corporate hive sat Richard Kane, the CEO of Apex Industries. His corner office on the top floor provided a panoramic view of the city he believed he ruled. Richard was a man in his early 50s, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His tailored suits and perfectly styled hair signified wealth and power. Richard stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, gazing down at the tiny figures far below. A smirk played on his lips as he considered the company's latest quarterly report. Profits were up, and that was all that mattered to him. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he barked, not bothering to turn around. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Emily, entered the room. "Mr. Kane, the board meeting is about to start." Richard nodded curtly. "I'll be there shortly." As Emily turned to leave, he added, "And ensure those reports from accounting are on my desk by noon. No excuses this time." Emily nodded quickly and hurried out of the office. Richard adjusted his tie and strode towards the boardroom, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. The boardroom fell silent as Richard entered. The executives around the table straightened in their chairs, their expressions a mix of fear and admiration. Richard took his seat at the head of the table and began the meeting without preamble. "Gentlemen, let's get straight to the point. Our profits are up, but they're not sufficient. I want to see a 20% increase by next quarter. I don't care how you achieve it. Cut costs, boost productivity, or let go of the dead weight. Just make it happen." The meeting continued in this manner for the next hour. Richard dominated the conversation, dismissing concerns and rejecting any ideas that didn't align with his vision of maximum profit. By the time the meeting ended, the executives filed out, looking exhausted and defeated. As Richard returned to his office, he passed by the cleaning staff preparing for their evening shift. He barely acknowledged them, viewing them as nothing more than part of the office decor. Among the cleaning staff was John Harris, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a weathered face. John moved quietly and efficiently, pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. His blue uniform was clean and pressed, and his movements were precise and purposeful. John had been at Apex Industries for the past 2 years. He came in every evening, did his job thoroughly, and left without fuss. Most of the daytime employees hardly noticed him, and that was how John preferred it. As John made his way through the office, he overheard snippets of conversation. Stressed employees discussed impossible deadlines and the fear of layoffs. John listened silently, his face revealing no emotion. In the break room, 2 junior executives were gossiping. "Did you hear about the latest firing?" one whispered. "Kay fired the entire marketing team because their campaign didn't boost sales enough." The other executive shook his head. "That's Kane for you. He'd sell his own mother if it meant a bump in the stock price." John quietly emptied the trash bins and wiped down the tables, seemingly oblivious to the conversation, but his sharp and observant eyes took in every detail of his surroundings. As the weeks passed, the pressure at Apex Industries continued to escalate. Richard Kane pushed his employees harder and harder, demanding longer hours and better results. The atmosphere in the office grew increasingly tense, with people jumping at the slightest noise and constantly looking over their shoulders. Through it all, John Harris continued his nightly routine. He cleaned offices, emptied trash bins, and mopped floors with the same quiet efficiency. If he noticed the growing stress and fear among the employees, he gave no sign of it. One evening, as John was cleaning the executive bathrooms, he overheard Richard Kane berating an employee over the phone. "I don't care about your family emergency," Richard snarled. "Either you close that deal by tomorrow, or you can start looking for a new job. Is that clear?" John paused in his work for a moment, his hand tightening slightly on the mop handle. Then, without a word, he resumed his cleaning. The tensions at Apex Industries came to a head during the company's annual gala. The event was held in the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel, with hundreds of employees and clients in attendance. Richard Kay stood at the center of it all, a glass of champagne in his hand and a practiced smile on his face. John Harris was there too, part of the catering staff hired for the event. He moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres, his movements smooth and unobtrusive. Most of the guests didn't even notice him as they took food from his tray. As the night wore on, Richard Kane's false charm began to wear thin. He'd had a few too many drinks, and his true nature was starting to show. He loudly berated a young intern for a minor mistake, leaving the poor girl in tears. John watched this scene unfold from across the room, his face impassive. He continued to circulate with his tray, but his eyes never left Richard Kane for long. The pivotal moment came late in the evening. John was making his way through a particularly crowded area of the ballroom when someone bumped into him from behind. John stumbled forward, trying to regain his balance. Unfortunately, he collided with none other than Richard Kane. Time seemed to slow down as John's tray tilted. Glasses of red wine spilled their contents, splashing across Richard's expensive white shirt and suit jacket. A hush fell over the nearby guests as Richard looked down at his ruined clothes, his face turning an alarming shade of red. When he looked up at John, his eyes were filled with fury. "You clumsy oaf!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It's probably worth more than you make in a year." John stood straight, his face calm. "I apologize, sir. It was an accident." But Richard was beyond listening. The alcohol and his natural arrogance had removed any filters he might have had. "An accident? You're an accident. You're nothing but a worthless janitor who can't even do his job properly. People like you are a dime a dozen. I could replace you in a heartbeat with someone who knows how to walk without tripping over their own feet." John remained silent, his eyes fixed on Richard. There was something in that steady gaze that might have given Richard pause if he had been sober enough to notice it. But he was too caught up in his own rage. "In fact," Richard continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "you're fired. I don't want to see your face in my building ever again. Do you understand me, you useless piece of trash?" The entire ballroom was silent now, all eyes on the confrontation. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others seemed to be enjoying the drama, but no one stepped in to intervene. John slowly set down his tray on a nearby table. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I understand, Mr. Kane. I'll collect my things and leave immediately." Richard sneered. "Good. And don't even think about trying to sue the company. I've got an army of lawyers who will bury you if you so much as think about it." Without another word, John turned and walked out of the ballroom. The guests parted to let him pass, many avoiding eye contact out of embarrassment or discomfort. As the door closed behind John, the spell seemed to break. Conversations slowly resumed, though many were now discussing what they had just witnessed. Richard, still fuming, stormed off to try and salvage his ruined clothes. In the hallway outside the ballroom, John Harris walked towards the staff area, his face as calm as ever, betraying no hint of the humiliation he had just endured. But there was a new tension in his shoulders, a purposefulness in his stride that hadn't been there before. As he changed out of his catering uniform, John's mind was already working, processing what had happened and what it meant. He had known this job wouldn't last forever, but he hadn't expected it to end quite like this. As John prepared to leave, Sarah Johnson, the head of HR, approached him, her face creased with concern. "John," she said softly, "I'm so sorry about this. Is there anything I can do?" John shook his head, offering a small smile. "No need to apologize, Miss Johnson. These things happen." Sarah frowned. "But it's not right. Mr. Kane's behavior was completely unprofessional. We could fight this dismissal if you want." John's eyes softened. "I appreciate your concern, but it's not necessary. Sometimes it's best to know when to walk away." Sarah studied John's face, sensing there was more to this quiet janitor than met the eye. "You're taking this remarkably well, John. Most people would be angry or upset." John shrugged. "I've faced worse than an angry boss, Miss Johnson. This is just another chapter closing." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You know, John, I've always felt there was something different about you. You carry yourself differently than most people in your position." John picked up his box. "We all have our stories, Miss Johnson. Mine just happens to be a bit longer than most." As John turned to leave, Sarah called out, "John, if you ever need anything, a reference, or just someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to call me." John nodded, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Johnson. Your kindness won't be forgotten." With that,
John walked towards the elevator, the security guard following close behind.
As the doors closed, several employees gathered around Sarah. "Poor John," one of them murmured. "He didn't deserve that." Sarah nodded, her eyes still on the closed elevator doors. "No, he didn't, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more to John Harris than we ever knew." Another employee chimed in. "Did you see how calm he was? It was almost unnerving." Sarah turned to her colleagues. "Whatever John's story is, I have a feeling we've only seen the tip of the iceberg, and something tells me this isn't the last we'll hear of him." As the group dispersed, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. John Harris had left the building, but she had a nagging suspicion that his story with Apex Industries was far from over. In the shadows of the city's underbelly, a new threat was emerging. Victor V.A.V., a ruthless gangster with a reputation for violence and cunning, sat at the head of a long table in a dimly lit room. Around him were his top lieutenants, each with a cold, calculating look in their eyes. Victor leaned forward, his scarred face illuminated by the lone light hanging above the table.
"Gentlemen, our next target is Apex Industries. It's time we expanded our operations, and this company is the perfect front for our money laundering scheme." He spread out several documents on the table: financial reports, employee records, and building schematics of Apex Industries. "Our inside man has provided us with everything we need.
Apex is vulnerable, and its CEO, Richard Kane, is arrogant enough to make our job easier." One of Victor's men spoke up. "Boss, what's our approach?" Victor's lips curled into a cruel smile.
"We start with intimidation. Threaten Kane.
Make him realize he's not as untouchable as he thinks. If he's smart, he'll cooperate. If not..."
Victor's hand moved to the gun holstered at his side. "We'll take more direct action."
The room filled with sinister chuckles. Victor continued. "Once we have control, we'll use Apex's legitimate business as a cover for our operations. Their international connections make them perfect for moving our money around undetected." Victor stood up, his imposing figure casting a long shadow.
"Prepare the first message."
It's time to introduce ourselves to Mr. Kane. The next day, Richard Kane arrived at his office, his mind already racing with plans to increase profits. As he settled behind his desk, his assistant entered, looking nervous.
"Mr.
Kane, this was delivered for you this morning. It's marked urgent and confidential." Richard snatched the envelope from her hand, irritated by the interruption. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, his face paled slightly. The letter was a threat, plain and simple. It detailed knowledge of Apex financial dealings, including some that skirted the edge of legality. The writer demanded a substantial sum of money in exchange for silence, with a warning of dire consequences if the demand was ignored. For a moment, Richard felt a flicker of fear, but as quickly as it came, it was replaced by anger. How dare someone try to threaten him? He was Richard Kane, CEO of Apex Industries. He didn't bow to threats.
Richard crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. "Ignore it," he snapped at his assistant. "It's probably some lowlife trying to scam us. I don't have time for this nonsense." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, shouldn't we inform the authorities?" Richard scoffed.
"And admit to them that someone's trying to blackmail us? Absolutely not. It would tank our stock prices if this got out. No, we handle this ourselves. Increase security if you must, but otherwise, it's business as usual."
Over the next few weeks, the threats escalated. More letters arrived, each more detailed and menacing than the last. Strange men were spotted lurking around Apex's headquarters. Employees reported being followed home. Despite the growing unease among his staff, Richard remained stubborn. He refused to acknowledge the danger, brushing off concerns and doubling down on his work. In his mind, this was all an elaborate bluff, and he wasn't about to fold. One evening, as Richard worked late in his office, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was deep and accented. "Now." "Mr. Kane, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Richard frowned. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" The voice chuckled. "My name is Victor, Mr. Kane. As for how I got your number, let's just say I have my ways. I believe you've been receiving my messages." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "So you're the one behind these pathetic threats. Listen here, you lowlife." Victor cut him off. "No, Mr. Kane, you listen. I've been patient, but my patience has limits. You have one last chance to cooperate. Transfer the money by midnight, or face the consequences. Richard's face flushed with anger. You don't scare me, Victor. I've dealt with better men than you. Try anything, and I'll bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again. There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Victor spoke, his voice dangerously soft. Very well, Mr. Kane. You've made your choice. Remember this moment. The line went dead. Richard slammed the phone down, his hand shaking slightly. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind. Had he made a mistake? But he quickly pushed the thought away. He was Richard Kane. He didn't back down from anyone. 2 days later, it was business as usual at Apex headquarters. Employees bustled about, the air filled with the usual mix of stress and ambition. Richard sat in his office reviewing reports and barking orders over the phone. The first sign that something was wrong came when the lights flickered, then went out completely. Emergency generators kicked in, bathing the offices in an eerie dim light. Richard stormed out of his office. What the hell is going on? He demanded of you. Before anyone could answer, the elevator doors opened. Men in black tactical gear poured out, their faces masked and weapons drawn. Screams erupted as employees realized what was happening. Nobody move, one of the masked men shouted. This is a takeover. Cooperate and no one gets hurt. Richard stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. This couldn't be happening. Not to him, not to his company. A tall figure emerged from the group of intruders. He removed his mask, revealing a face scarred by violence and eyes cold as ice. Mr. Kane, Victor said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. I believe we have some unfinished business. Richard's shock gave way to anger. You won't get away with this, he snarled. Do you have any idea who I am? Who I know? Victor's hand shot out, grabbing Richard by the throat. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Kane. An arrogant fool who thought he was untouchable. He released Richard, who gasped for air. Now you're going to learn just how wrong you were. Victor turned to his men. Secure the building! Round up all the employees. Mr. Kane and I are going to have a little chat in his office. As Victor's men spread out, herding terrified employees into groups, Victor pushed Richard back into his office. He closed the door behind them, the sound echoing with finality. Outside, chaos reigned. Sarah from HR tried to calm a group of panicking interns, while keeping a wary eye on the armed men patrolling the floor. In the finance department, a brave soul attempted to call for help, only to find all communications had been cut off. Victor's men worked with military precision, securing each floor of the building. They set up barricades at key points, transforming the once bustling office into an impenetrable fortress. In the lobby, local law enforcement began to gather, alerted by concerned passers-by who had seen the armed men enter the building. But they were at a loss, unable to penetrate the suddenly fortified Apex headquarters. Back in Richard's office, Victor lounged in the CEO's chair, feet propped up on the expensive desk. Richard stood before him, his face a mask of fury and fear. Now, Mr. Kane, Victor said, his voice deceptively calm, let's discuss the future of Apex Industries. Now, I think you'll find I can be quite persuasive when I need to be. Richard's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. But as he looked into Victor's cold eyes, he realized with growing horror that his options had run out. The consequences of his arrogance were about to come crashing down, not just on him, but on every employee in the building. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Apex Industries stood silent and besieged. Inside, employees huddled together, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Armed men patrolled the floors, their weapons a constant reminder of the danger everyone was in. In his office, Richard Kane sat slumped in a chair, his usual confidence shattered. Victor paced before him, outlining his plans for Apex Industries in chilling detail. The company Richard had built, the empire he had ruled over with an iron fist, was slipping through his fingers. Outside, police lights flashed, and a crowd of onlookers gathered. News vans pulled up, their reporters eager for any scrap of information about the unfolding drama. As night fell, the tension inside Apex headquarters continued to build. Victor's men grew more agitated, fingers twitching on triggers. The hostages, including Richard, wondered how long this nightmare would last,
and how it would end. As the hostage situation at Apex Industries stretched into its third hour, tension inside the building reached a fever pitch. In a corner of the main office, Sarah Johnson, the head of HDR, huddled with a group of frightened employees. Her mind raced, searching for any way to help their dire situation. Suddenly, a memory flashed through Sarah's mind. John Harris, the janitor they had fired just weeks ago. She recalled his calm demeanor, the way he handled pressure with ease. There was always something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. With shaking hands, Sarah pulled out her phone. By some miracle, she still had a signal. She scrolled through her contacts, finding John's number, kept for reference checks. Taking a deep breath, she pressed call. Miles away, John's phone buzzed. Harry. He glanced at the screen, surprise flickering across his face as he recognized the number. Miss Johnson, he answered, his voice low and steady. John, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I know this is strange, but we need help. The company, we're being held hostage. I don't know why, but I felt I had to call you. You always seemed so capable. John's face hardened as he listened to Sarah's hurried explanation of the situation. I understand, Miss Johnson. Stay calm. I'll be there soon. As John ended the call, his mind shifted gears. The calm, unassuming janitor facade fell away, replaced by the sharp focus of a trained operative. He moved swiftly, gathering the gear he had prepared earlier. As John suited up, memories flooded back. His stack. Flashbacks of his time in Special Forces played through his mind. A young John, fresh-faced and determined, standing at attention as he completed his training. John leading a team through a dense jungle, his movements silent and precise. A mission gone wrong. Explosions, gunfire, the agonized cries of his teammates. John shook his head, pushing the memories away. He had left that life behind, or so he thought. But now, his past skills were needed once again. Within minutes, John was in his nondescript car, driving towards Apex Industries. As he approached, he could see the police barricade and the crowd of onlookers. News vans lined the street, reporters delivering live updates to anxious viewers. John parked a block away, out of sight. He studied the building, his trained eyes picking out entry points and potential weaknesses. He recognized the tactics being used by the hostage-takers. These weren't amateurs. This was a well-organized, dangerous group. Moving silently, John made his way to the back of the building. He found a service entrance locked and guarded. With practiced ease, he neutralized the guard, using a sleeper hold to render him unconscious without a sound. Inside the building, John moved like a shadow. He avoided the main areas, instead using his knowledge of the building's layout to navigate through rarely used corridors and maintenance shafts. As he moved, John's mind raced, formulating a plan. He needed to assess the situation, find out how many hostage-takers there were, and locate the hostages. And he needed to do it all without alerting the criminals to his presence. John found a security room, its occupants clearly having fled when the attack began. He quickly accessed the security camera feeds, scanning the screens for information. What he saw made his blood run cold. The hostage-takers were heavily armed and well-organized. They had control of all the main areas of the building, with hostages gathered in several locations. At the center of it all, he saw Richard Kane, the CEO who had fired him, being held separately in his office by a man John assumed was the leader. John's jaw clenched. The situation was worse than he had imagined. These weren't just criminals. They were trained, possibly ex-military. This would require all of his skills and experience. Moving away from the security room, John found a maintenance closet he had used during his time as a janitor. Hidden behind a loose panel was a small cache of equipment, tools, and weapons he had stashed away just in case. John had always believed in being prepared, a habit from his military days that had never quite left him. As John geared up, he felt a familiar calm settle over him. The years seemed to fall away, muscle memory taking over as he checked and loaded his weapons. This was what he was trained for. This was what he excelled at. With his equipment ready, John began to move through the building. His first priority was to thin out the hostage-takers' numbers without raising the alarm. He needed to create confusion and disarray among their ranks. John's first encounter came on the third floor. Two armed men were patrolling a hallway, their movements betraying their military background. John waited, timing his move perfectly as the men passed by his hiding spot. John struck in a flurry of silent, precise movements. He incapacitated both men before they could even register his presence. He quickly secured them, hiding their unconscious forms in a nearby office. Moving on, John continued his silent assault, floor by floor. He took down the hostage-takers. Each encounter was a testament to his skills. Quick, efficient, and most importantly, quiet. In the main office area, a group of employees huddled together, guarded by 3 armed men. John observed the scene, formulating a plan. He needed to take out the guards without endangering the hostages. Using a small mirror, John created a distraction, reflecting light to catch the attention of one of the guards. As the man moved to investigate, John struck. In a matter of seconds, all 3 guards were down, the hostages looking on in stunned silence. Sarah, among the group of hostages, stared at John in disbelief. Gone was the quiet janitor she knew. In his place stood a man of lethal efficiency, his movements speaking of years of training and experience. "John," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and shock. John put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. He quickly ushered the group to a safer location, giving them brief instructions on how to stay hidden and safe. As John continued his one-man assault on the hostage-takers, word began to spread among their ranks. Something was wrong. Men were disappearing. Communication was breaking down. The once confident criminals began to show signs of fear and confusion. In the command center they had set up, Victor received the disturbing reports, his face darkening with anger and disbelief. How could this be happening? They had planned for every contingency, or so he thought. "Find out what's going on," he barked at his lieutenant. "I want this threat neutralized now." But John was always one step ahead. Years of training and experience had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He anticipated the hostage-takers' moves, using their own tactics against them. As John worked his way through the building, the tide began to turn. The once organized criminal operation began to crumble. Panic set in among the hostage-takers as they realized they were up against something they hadn't prepared for. In his office, Richard Kane listened to the growing chaos outside with a mix of fear and hope. Something was happening, something that was throwing his captors into disarray. But what? Or who? John's progress through the building was like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. Each encounter showcased a different aspect of his immense skill set. Hand-to-hand combat, weapons proficiency, tactical awareness. John was a one-man army. The remaining criminals, now aware of the threat, began to group together for protection. But this only made John's job easier. He used their fear against them, employing psychological tactics to further break down their morale. As the night wore on, the situation inside Apex Industries had dramatically shifted. What had started as a well-executed hostage situation had devolved into chaos, and at the center of it all was John Harris, the unassuming janitor turned one-man rescue team. Outside, the police and onlookers remained unaware of the dramatic events unfolding inside the building. But soon, very soon, the world would learn of the incredible story of the janitor who saved Apex Industries. John paused for a moment, catching his breath. Here, he had cleared most of the building, but the hardest part was yet to come. The leader, Victor, was still holed up in the CEO's office with Richard Kane. John knew this final confrontation would be the most dangerous. As he prepared for this last crucial phase of his rescue mission, John allowed himself a grim smile. The quiet life he had built for himself was over, but in its place, he had rediscovered a part of himself he thought long buried. The part that lived for this, the part that excelled in chaos and danger. With renewed determination, John moved towards the CEO's office. The final showdown was about to begin, and John Harris was ready for whatever came next. As John neared the office, he could hear Victor's agitated voice through the door. The criminal leader was clearly unnerved by the chaos John had caused. "What do you mean you can't find him?" Victor shouted. "It's one man! How hard can it be?" John took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, with explosive force, he burst through the door. The scene inside froze for a split second. Victor stood behind Richard's desk, a phone in one hand and a gun in the other. Richard was tied to a chair, his face bruised and eyes wide with shock.
John's entrance caught Victor off guard, but the criminal recovered quickly.
He fired 2 shots at John, who rolled to the side, taking cover behind a large filing cabinet.
"Who the hell are you?"
Victor snarled, his gun trained on John's position. John's voice was calm when he replied, "Just the janitor coming to clean up your mess." Victor's face contorted with rage.
"The janitor?
"You're the one who's been taking down my men?"
From his position, John could see Richard's face.
The CEO's expression had transformed from fear to utter disbelief as he recognized his former employee. John spoke again, his voice steady. "Victor, you're outmatched. Your men are down, and the police will be here soon. It's over." Victor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound.
"Over?
"I don't think so. I still have the CEO. As long as I have him, I have leverage." John's mind raced, analyzing the situation. He needed to get Victor away from Richard without endangering the CEO further.
"You're right, Victor," John said, his voice taking on a casual tone. "You do have leverage, but what's your endgame here? The building is surrounded. There's no way out." Doubt flickered across Victor's face.
John pressed his advantage, using the psychological tactics he'd learned in his Special Forces training. "Your men are either unconscious or have fled. You're alone, even if you make it out of this room. Where will you go?" Victor's grip on his gun tightened. "Shut up. I'm the one in control here," John continued, his voice calm and reasonable. "Are you? Look at your situation, Victor. Really look at it. You started this night thinking you'd take over a company. Now you're trapped in an office, your plan in shambles. Is this how you pictured it ending?" Victor's composure began to crack. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route.
John knew he was getting through. In that moment of distraction, John made his move. He vaulted over the filing cabinet, closing the distance between them with incredible speed. Victor fired wildly, but John was already upon him. In a blur of motion, John disarmed Victor, the gun clattering to the floor.
The 2 men grappled, fierce hand-to-hand combat ensuing. Victor was strong and skilled, but John was in a league of his own. Each of John's moves was precise, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Richard watched in awe as his former janitor battled the dangerous criminal. John's movements were a far cry from the unassuming man who used to clean the offices. This was a highly trained operative in action. The fight was intense but brief. Within minutes, John had Victor pinned to the ground. The criminal leader's arm twisted painfully behind his back. "It's over, Victor," John said, his breathing only slightly labored. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Victor struggled for a moment more before going limp, the fight draining out of him. Who are you really?" he gasped. John didn't answer. Instead, he quickly secured Victor with zip ties he produced from his pocket.
Once the criminal was restrained, John turned his attention to Richard. "Are you all right, Mr. Kane?" John asked as he untied the CEO. Richard rubbed his wrists, staring at John with a mix of gratitude and bewilderment. "John, I
don't understand. How did you—" "What?" John gave a small, wry smile. "It's a long story, sir. One I'm sure we'll have time for later."
Just then, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The police, having received word that the situation was under control, were finally entering the building. John turned to Victor, who lay defeated on the floor.
"Looks like your ride is here." As they waited for the police to reach them, Richard couldn't take his eyes off John. The CEO's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the quiet janitor he had fired with the skilled operative he had just witnessed in action.
"John," Richard said, his voice hoarse.
"I was wrong about you. So wrong. I'm sorry for how I treated you." John nodded, accepting the apology without comment. His focus was still on securing the area and ensuring everyone's safety.
Soon, the office was swarming with police officers. They took Victor into custody, along with the rest of his incapacitated men. Throughout the building, paramedics arrived to treat the injured, including Richard. As the chaos of the police operation swirled around them, John stood to the side, giving his statement to a detective. Richard watched him, still trying to process the night's events. Sarah from HR approached Richard, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Kane, are you all right? We were so worried." Richard nodded absently, his eyes still on John. Sarah. Did you know about John? I mean. Sarah shook her head.
Not really, sir. I always felt there was more to him than met the eye. That's why I called him when this all started.
Richard's eyebrows shot up.
You called him? You're the reason he came back? Sarah nodded, a small smile on her face. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts, sir. As the night wore on, the full scale of John's actions became clear. He had single-handedly taken down a dangerous criminal syndicate, saved countless lives, and prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation for Apex Industries. The media was in a frenzy, clamoring for details about the hero janitor who had saved the day.
John, however, shied away from the attention, preferring to remain in the background. As dawn broke, the last of the police were leaving the Apex building. Out. John stood outside, watching the sunrise when Richard approached him. "John," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I don't even know how to begin thanking you.
You saved my life, my company, everything."
John turned to face his former employer. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Kane. I did what needed to be done."
Richard shook his head. "No, I do need to thank you. And I need to apologize. The way I treated you, it was inexcusable. I was arrogant, dismissive. I judged you based on your job, never bothering to see the man behind it."
John remained silent, letting Richard continue.
"I've learned a hard lesson today," Richard said, "about judging people, about the value of every person in an organization. I was so focused on profits and power that I lost sight of what really matters." John nodded, a small smile on his face. "That's a valuable lesson, Mr. Kane. I hope you remember it." Richard straightened up, a determined look in his eyes. "I will, John. And I want to make things right. Come back to Apex. Not as a janitor, but in a position that makes use of your skills. Head of security, perhaps, or any role you want. Name it and it's yours." John chuckled softly. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Kane, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline. My quiet life as a janitor is over, but I'm not looking to jump back into the corporate world either." Richard looked crestfallen. "I understand, but if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. Apex will always have a place for you." John nodded his thanks. As he turned to leave, Richard called out one last time. "John, what will you do now?" John paused, looking back at the Apex building, then out at the city beyond. "I'm not sure, Mr. Kane, but I have a feeling my particular set of skills might still be needed out there. There are always messes to clean up one way or another." With that, John walked away, disappearing into the early morning crowd. Richard watched him go, a mix of gratitude and regret washing over him as the sun rose fully, casting its light over the Apex building. Richard Kane stood alone, a changed man. The events of the night had shaken him to his core, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about success, leadership, and the value of every individual. Inside the building, employees were starting to arrive, murmuring in shock at the signs of the night's events. Sarah greeted them, offering reassurances and support. The Apex Industries they were walking into today was not the same as the one they had left yesterday. Change was coming, sparked by the unlikely hero who had once walked these halls unnoticed. And somewhere in the city, John Harris walked on, ready for whatever challenge might come next. The quiet janitor was gone, but in his place stood a man who had rediscovered his purpose. The world might not know his name, but it would feel the impact of his actions for years to come. As Apex Industries began the process of recovery and renewal, the legend of the hero janitor began to spread. It would serve as a reminder to all that heroes can come from the most unexpected places, and that every person, regardless of their position, has value and potential. The night's events had changed everything for Richard, for Apex, and for John. But as the city woke up to a new day, one thing was certain. The impact of John Harris, the unassuming janitor turned hero, would be felt for a long time to come.